Our name is Jonathan Meades, and this series is called Abroad Again. It lifts the stones of British buildings to reveal the life forms beneath them. Follow us down a B-road of discovery, down life's lonely highway of adventure. So abroad again then, for a social experiment which has touched every one of us, really.
Heaven, Folkwoven in England. In the land that never was, there was so much lead in the lights that the inhabitants of these houses were poisoned and rendered imbecilic. In the land that never was, the wood was waney. No one could saw in a straight line. That'll have been because of the lead poisoning. In the land that never was, thatch was poured, like Crimper's treacle. No wonder that 1970s light entertainers came to covet such houses. They enjoyed the security of two hairdos.
Where is this? Where is this? Where is this?
West London, since you ask. But it might be anywhere in England. Much of England looks like this. No other European country does.
When did this happen?
1928. But it might have been 1918, or 1938, or, astonishingly, even 1988. Comforting hedges, cosy wicket gates, mellow brick paving, sweetly hanging tiles. Here are the means of escape from the most murderous century. We walk forever down false memory lane, yearning for a place where the oak was beyond a joke, for a time when the quaintness was 100% proof.
An Englishman's home is his fantasy. We're so inured to architectural escapism that we hardly acknowledge it. And we hardly stop to consider that the bucolic past that such houses represent was brutal, cold, diseased, incestuous, and that our forebears spent much of their life in pain.
We take this stylistic escapism for granted. We're running away from what? From ourselves? Why?
This is Richard Wagner writing in 1855. Here is Alberic's dream of Nibelheim, come to life. World domination, frenetic activity, oppression by steam and by fog.
Alberic is the grotesque dwarf of the ring cycle, the autocrat of a subterranean hell of mines and primitive machines, where perpetual night reigns and the inhabitants are the living dead.
The place that Wagner was comparing to Nibelheim was London, the largest city on earth, the most industrialized city on earth. Nothing like it had ever previously existed in actuality.
Though something akin to it had evidently existed in the apocalyptic fantasies of such artists as Wagner himself, and Bosch, Boots, Bruegel. Epic catastrophe wrought by cosmic wrath, Gotterdammerung. The whole world came to gape in appalled wonderment at the sublimity and squalor, the magnificence and destitution. London was a thrilling dystopia. That's how it was represented by Cooper of Olney, by Cobbett, Dickens, Mayhew, Augustus Egg, Charles Kingsley, Hippolyte Taine, George Gissing, James Thompson, Gustave Doré. The London that Dr. Johnson had equated with life itself was a city of 500,000 inhabitants. Little more than a century later, it had swollen to become the Victorian megalopolis of 6.5 million inhabitants, which was all too readily tired of.
The population increased by 500,000 during each decade of the 19th century. Bronson Alcott, father of the author of Little Women, described it as a huge den wherein Beelzebub whelps.
As London had grown, so had the number of voices fretting about the multitude of problems it occasioned. Mortal diseases, vagrancy, crime, drunkenness, starvation, pauperism were commonplace. Rioting was unastonishingly routine. London's administration was chaotically corrupt. In 1855, the rights to excise tolls on roads were still sold at auction. There was no public provision for drainage or waste disposal. The water supply, much of it contaminated, was divided between 8 competing companies. At the root of this chaos was the economic Darwinism of an unregulated market. It was a doctrine, and any challenge to the primacy of commercial interests was a sort of heresy.
As the MP and industrialist Joseph Cowan put it, noise of workshops rose like music of another epoch to proclaim the dawn of the day when trade asserted its independence and industry claimed its rights.
The megalopolis was, until the second half of the 19th century, regarded as an inevitability, a force of corrupted nature. The great philanthropists, the Earl of Shaftesbury, Thomas Barnardo, Baroness Burdett-Coutts, believed that their initiatives would eventually create a city that was livable and just. They worked within the system, effecting reforms through legislation, moralistic paternalism, and the hand of God, which hand was also responsible for a vigorous program of Anglican church building.
Throughout the 1840s and 50s, Anglican churches were consecrated at the rate of more than 2 a week. Institutionalized superstition was deemed to be the remedy for cholera and, equally, for the sweated slavery of child labor. The path to betterment was paved in tiny blood-stained bandages, for the well-meant fixes were no more effective than the application of an elastoplast to a rectal hemorrhage.
In the second half of the 19th century, the emphasis of anti-urbanism shifted away from fulmination and denunciation. Such ragings were merely the sound of the impotent rattling their bars. If London was the city of the future, then the future was to be avoided. To free traders, Matthew Arnold's dismissals of unrestrained capitalism sounded like heretical echoes of Milton. His mammon was the least erected spirit that fell from heaven. Arnold demanded some other criterion of man's well-being than the cities he has built and the manufactures he has produced. What an unsound habit of mind it must be that makes us think of things like coal or iron as constituting the greatness of England. The ideal city is one of the archetypes of human invention. Such cities have fed each other down the ages, from Plato's Republic, unbuilt, through Claude Nicolas Ledoux' Arc-et-Senon in eastern France, partially built and glorious, to Titus Salt's Saltaire near Bradford, wholly built and dismal, its gateway enjoined, "Abandon beer, all ye that enter here." Victorian reformers fretted about the shape that a new chapter in human habitation might take. There were countless competing models to choose from, dreams that might be turned into actual parks, into unprecedented physical spaces. Projections of the future city subscribed to the orthodoxy that scientific materialism had enabled man to triumph over nature. Further, scientific materialism generated moral improvement. These beliefs were shared by the improbable galère of Karl Marx and the Prince Consort, Faraday and Tennyson, Jules Verne and Charles Darwin.
Natural selection was the apogee of the high Victorian belief in progress towards the ultimate perfection of mankind. Natural selection was progress's greatest validation.
There was a further consensus that applied science would provide the solutions to the city. What was not yet called science fiction was held to be accurately predictive. But which imagined future would come to pass? In National Evils and Practical Remedies, the writer and MP James Silk Buckingham proposed a model city called Victoria. It comprised concentric squares, iron buildings whose flat roofs formed public spaces, compulsory schools, avenues with such names as Justice, Fortitude, Concord, Unity, precisely 10,000 inhabitants housed according to which of 10 classes they belonged to. There were to be no gin palaces or cigar divans, no blind alleys or cul-de-sacs for the retirement of the filthy and immoral from the public eye. Sir Benjamin Ward Richardson's vision was of Hygeia, a city whose 100,000 population would inhabit 20,000 houses on 4,000 acres. Hygeia was to be ruled by a cadre of sanitary engineers under a superintendent sanitary engineer. It should come as no surprise that Richardson was a pioneering sanitary engineer. Sewage was his meat and drink, so to speak. He was also a proselytizing teetotaler and an anaesthetist. In that capacity, he gave the world amyl nitrate. His vision of universal abstinence did not extend to foreseeing its use as the recreational sex drug known as poppers. The Bostonian socialist and editor Edward Bellamy posited his ideal future in a novel. Looking Backwards was published in 1888 and set in the year 2000. in an America of welfarism, nationalism, and egalitarianism. The state controls production and individual wealth. There are electronic communications, state credits in lieu of money, centralized distribution of goods. The race has been purified by selective breeding.
Crime is euphemized as atavism and is treated medically rather than punitively. Reason and material progress have succeeded in reshaping mankind. Everyone subsumes self and strives in concert for the commonwealth. The world didn't have to wait till the year 2000, only till 1917. Looking backwards sold millions. The public appetite for such projections was immense. Edward Bellamy's disciples included his English contemporary, Ebenezer Howard, veteran of an agrarian commune in Nebraska, a commune which had failed. Howard had become a typewriter engineer in Chicago, which briefly and puzzlingly in the 1870s was known as Garden City. Back in England, he worked as a parliamentary stenographer. He pottered purposefully. His kingdom was his shed. In 1898, he published Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform. From its second edition, it was known as Garden Cities of Tomorrow. It's a synthesis of half a century's dreamed futures, Bellamy's, Richardson's, Buckingham's, numberless other tracts. Howard was more inventor than visionary. His vision was borrowed second-hand. That it actually came to be realized is evidence, if any were needed, that originality shouldn't be too original. Howard's Garden City would occupy 1,000 acres and would be surrounded by 5,000 acres of agricultural land and allotments, the original Greenbelt. 30,000 people would live there in a state of near self-sufficiency. The garden citizens would consume 1,250 gallons of milk per day.
And he drove the fastest milk car in the West.
If the milk was produced locally, £1,900 per annum would be saved in transportation costs. Milk supply would be monopolistic, in the interests of both milkman and customer. According to Howard, if milkman is selling his milk for 4p a quart, and a rival milkman, also called milkman, enters the field, then milkman will be obliged, if he is to maintain his level of profits, to dilute his milk with water. Howard's preoccupation with the economies of small scale is obsessive and dotty. Yet Garden Cities of Tomorrow possessed a plausibility which its sources had lacked, precisely because Howard was an artless plodder. His prose is numbingly dull. That's what comes from 25 years of transcribing parliamentary debates. He might have been addressing a dutiful audience of slow learners at a Christian socialist summer school. Men love combined effort, but they also love individual effort. Town and country must be married, he chirped, and out of this joyous union will come a new hope, a new life, a new civilization. He was right, of course, but not perhaps in the way that he anticipated. Garden Cities of Tomorrow is as compelling as a green paper. However, the political and philanthropic classes to whom Howard appealed to get his project off the ground recognized that he spoke their language. Now, much of what he floated was radical. Howard's plans were partly derived from Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase the survival of the fittest and who had advocated the nationalization of land on the dodgy grounds that had land not been taken into private ownership, individuals would no more make claim to it than they do to light and air. Howard merely posited municipal ownership of land.
he was too canny to upset the apple cart by talking of nationalisation. He knew that it's not utopians who get utopia built.
Time flies by when you're a driver of a train, speeding out of drums and with a cargo of cocaine. I get high when I'm the pilot of a plane, touching down in Camberwick, I'm stoned out of my brain. Under bridges, over bridges to our destination. Careful with that slip, Eugene, it causes condensation.
Howard's idea that manufacturer and milkman, shopkeeper and smallholder and all garden citizens should be employees of the garden city is hardly made explicit.
But then burying discomforting proposals is a standard tactic of politicians. Howard's manifesto is cautious. He never actually spells out that the garden city was to be a benevolent tyranny of the citizens for the citizens.
Garden City might be built anywhere that it could take advantage of the disparity in cost between urban land and rural land, whose paltry price was due to the late Victorian agricultural depression. Letchworth, 40 miles north of London, was the 7th site that Howard's Garden City Pioneer Company had considered.
The economist Alfred Marshall stated that 150,000 people in London in the clothes-making trade are doing work which is against all economic reason to have done where ground rent is high. Howard eagerly misinterpreted this. In other words, these 150,000 people should not be in London at all. They should be in Garden City, which Howard conceived of as an internal colony, whose inhabitants would be the subject of what he calls organised migrations. Howard's prescriptions were demographically, fiscally and economically coercive. Sunday drivers are commonplace, Sunday social engineers are not.
The matter of what Garden City would actually look like is one that he quite fails to consider. It's as though mere aesthetic matters were beneath him. Indifference to architecture, insensibility towards topography. No wonder, then, that Howard is considered the father of British town planning.
The first garden city of Letchworth was, to a degree, the product of chance. 4 of the leading architects of the day, Norman Shaw, Aston Webb, William Letherby and Halsey Ricardo, were approached to develop Letchworth's master plan and architectural template.
Had any of them accepted the commission, Letchworth would have looked very different. And the face of England in the 20th century would have looked very different.
Shaw and Webb were both, by 1900, working in the neo-Baroque idiom which defined London at the height of empire. And although Letherby and Ricardo were indissolubly linked to the arts and crafts, their buildings were a bane. As it was, the commission went to a couple of northern also-rans, Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin, who had attached themselves to the nascent Garden City movement, connecting well and being in the right place at the right time. Parker and Unwin were, confusingly, both cousins and brothers-in-law. They were younger than Howard, radical, uncompromising, Luddite. Parker wrote, "The influence of machinery on art is the most degrading we have to contend with." His solution was a return to medieval guilds and the nobility of manual labour.
The high priests of this insidious subculture did not have to suffer that nobility. They were men with private incomes. John Ruskin, a rotophobic virgin.
Ruskin once wrote, "In true utopia, man will harness himself with his oxen to his plough, rather than leave the devil to drive it, the devil being steam, which was to be used only for cutting icebergs."
William Morris, beard.
believed he could change the world with designs for expensive wallpaper and a horrible fade prose style. Marginally lower down the hieratic ladder came
Richard Jefferies, nature-worshipping pantheist inventor of what can only be called country writing.
pathological anti-urbanist. He refused to do any actual work on his family's Wiltshire farm.
Edward Carpenter, nature-worshipping pantheist inventor of what can only be called the simple life.
Homosexual mathematician and curate who abandoned Cambridge to become the vegetarian, Bhagavad Gita reading, sandal making, rational dressing, sunbathing, flour grinding, bread baking leader of a self-consciously primitive rural commune.
Parker and Unwin were mere foot soldiers in this New Age army of the 1880s and 90s. They were enthused by Carpenter. Unwin was a member of Morris's Socialist League. Parker had learnt to weave cloth and to forge metal.
Howard's second-hand vision would, if designed by the architects initially courted, have embraced the machine with technophiliac glee. Letchworth would have been a new town which looked new. But Parker and Unwin were in love with the past. This particular past was one where cosy frugality was a high virtue, manual production was equated with moral probity, mud was a balm, handcraft spelt righteousness, rough-cast walls were next to godliness, stocks were local colour, children's cheeks were rosy from fresh air rather than alcohol, which is Beelzebub's brew, and the maypole was not a penis.
Parker and Unwin were utterly conventional in their retrospection and in their belief in nature.
Nature is demeaned by its devotees. Nature's cunning and trickery are quite unnatural to the puritanical mentality which associates nature with dun colours and an absence of artifice.
Nature is a conjurer, a grand master of the magic circle.
Parker and Unwin combined and democratised two quintessentially English design types that had previously been exclusive. The first component of Parker and Unwin's formula was arts and crafts domestic architecture.
The arty bourgeoisie of the 1890s commissioned bespoke houses from architects who deluded themselves that they were down to earth, but were actually as twee as bunting.
Their method of construction was so painstaking that no more than a few hundred of them were built during that decade. They took as their models the humblest vernacular buildings. They were like absurdly overpriced pairs of jeans, former workers' clothes which no worker could afford. They attracted much attention, no doubt because they were quite outside the mainstream. They were, however, a germ, a seed. The applications of arts and crafts architecture were limited. It was inflexible. It demanded an informality of layout and the illusion of rusticity. The second ingredient was the picturesque model village. Such villages were typically built for employees of landed estates. They tended to cottagey theatricality. They were adornments to the landscape, eye-catchers. In the late 19th century, industrialists followed the aristocracy's example. Port Sunlight on the Wirral, the Cadbury's Bourneville on the edge of Birmingham. Before they came to Letchworth, Parker and Unwin had already designed New Earswick outside York for the Rowntrees, who, like the Cadburys, were Quakers, a sect that rashly hoped chocolate might replace alcohol.
No, I don't know about that.
Letchworth, as built, was a new town which pretended to be an old village. It was a new town nonetheless, a new type of place. To cultists of bucolicism, no future is so bright as the future which looks like an invented rustic past. All pasts are in some measure inventions.
Parker and Unwin dispensed with the more costly and labour-intensive elements of the arts and crafts style, such as thatch. They kept a cottagey quality. They built in bulk, fronting each plot with a large expanse of greensward. There were houses for the middle classes, and because Howard wanted Letchworth to be self-contained, a society in itself, there were buildings for the working classes too, smaller but still countrified and still arranged around expansive village greens. Their layout, no more than 12 dwellings to an acre, was obviously land-hungry. Letchworth Centre is small, and save for an area which is axially disposed, it displays no civic coherence. Domestic streets and avenues adjoin the centre, yet their impetus is visibly away from that centre, as though they are means of escape. The impetus is centrifugal. It is pulling out towards the country where the forebears of its houses are situated. The anemic colour of the bricks produced locally at Alsey so offended Parker and Unwin that they decreed rough cast should be applied wherever possible. Their dictatorial control of what they seemed to consider their fiefdom irritated Thomas Adams, the secretary of the Garden City Association.
Adams had a wheeze, a competition for the design of cheap cottages, each costing less than £150. Parker and Unwin took such umbrage that they moved on.
130 cottages were built. Certain of them are intriguing. Few are handmade.
Some are prefabricated.
Arts and crafts architecture was reduced to a series of mannerisms. Dormer windows, half-timbering, pitched roofs, little windows, leaded lights, low-tiled eaves, and so on. Mannerisms which were reckoned susceptible to mass production. Handcraft was imitated by machines, unconvincingly imitated. During the decade from its foundation until the outbreak of the First World War, Letchworth was a magnet. The painter Harold Gilman commissioned this house, lived here with his wife, and returned to London when they split up. Given his devotion to drab urban lives, it's surprising that he had left London in the first place. The house was rented in the summer of 1912 by his friend Spencer Gore. Unlike Gilman, he was inspired by the Garden City and made dozens of paintings of it. Ebenezer Howard had entertained a fantasy about the Garden City's self-sufficiency. It wasn't to be. However, Letchworth did attract some light industry. Land was a tenth of the cost in London and housing cheaper. Some factories duly paid lower wages than they had in the capital. Workers at the Laker Motor Company went on strike. The violence gives lie to the claim by the author of Le Cité Jardin, Georges Benoit Lévy, that Letchworth didn't need the 2 policemen it had.
And then there was Spirella, Castle Corset, which would become the major employer. Odd, given that corsets were the very garments that devotees of rational dress held in the greatest contempt. Tight lacing, as it was called, was claimed to cause damage to the uterus, the liver, and the stomach.
Managements professed a faith in the Garden City movement. They claimed that a concern for the well-being of their workforce was the reason that they had moved from London. A common complaint concerned the lack of unimproving recreational facilities and entertainments, such as the music hall, which occupied the moral low ground.
Furthermore, Letchworth's one pub was the pub with no beer. The Skittles was strictly teetotal. It sold cidrac, sarsaparilla, dandelion and burdock and cocoa. Letchworth wasn't to get licensed premises till 1959, and its first hotel, the Simple Life, was also teetotal. Its dining room was enticingly named the Food Reform Restaurant. The Simple Life was the muddy life.
For many years, the roads were not metalled. so commuters were obliged to change their footwear at the railway station lest they carry Hertfordshire clay onto London's streets. In the evenings and at weekends, clerks became smallholders, toiling for little reward.
Only a dozen miles away at Biggleswade, the rich topsoil supports abundant market gardens. But Letchworth is on a belt of chalk.
Its thin topsoil is inhospitable to professional agriculture. Many of the early migrants to Letchworth were no doubt inured to failures of self-sufficiency, for they were, like Howard, veterans of land colonies during the years of agricultural depression. No matter where these colonies were situated, no matter what religion the communards professed, their agronomical incompetence resulted in near starvation and in subsequent optimistic migration to another such colony. Letchworth became their refuge. It was purposely roughcast for them. There was strength in numbers. It was described as a huge experiment where minor experiments can be carried out. It was a laboratory whose research was into itself. The author of a huger and equally narcissistic experiment, the mass murder of V.I. Lenin, visited Letchworth in June 1907 after the 5th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party.
It had been held in North London at the Southgate Brotherhood Church, founded in the early 1890s by Bruce Wallace, who had subsequently migrated to Letchworth. Even though he had a cult of his own, Wallace was forever signing up for others. He was variously, perhaps simultaneously, a Presbyterian, a Congregationalist, a Christian Socialist, a member of the Fellowship of the New Life, a Tolstoyan, an adept of the Alpha Union. This tireless, credulous fellow was described by Ebenezer Howard as one of the most devoted servants of humanity. He was a publisher, a pamphleteer, a champion of the cooperative commonwealth, and a shopkeeper who sold vegetables. What else? His newspaper was devoted to community experiments. What else? Letchworth was a mecca for joiners. Its pioneers, that's the obligatory word, were people who sought a communality which they believed ordinary cities could not stimulate. The simple life was gregarious as well as muddy. It's all too easy to mock, but that's no reason not to mock it. The soft-brained enthusiasms of Letchworth's more intense inhabitants were the New Age crazes of their day, and like the New Age crazes of a century later, they soon became thoroughly conventionalized. Pioneers embraced any of the following. Poem 6 from 10.
Dew bathing.
Rolling around in the early morning dew in order to rebirth and holistically Kaplanize.
Wool next to the skin.
Itchy, but makes you a better person. Enables the body to expel toxic vapors, according to the dodgy zoologist Gustav Jaeger's sanitary woolen system.
Sleeping outdoors.
Damp, but makes you a better person. The practice of sleeping under the stars as a recreation was still a novelty in 1903. Thitherto it had been a chore to be endured by soldiers, tramps, and itinerant fruit pickers.
Cycling.
Another comparative novelty as a recreation. The vet John Boyd Dunlop's pneumatic tyre and Sturmey Archer gears were recent inventions.
Theosophy.
The cloisters was designed by a keen needleworker, W.H. Cowlishaw, for Annie Lawrence, whose interests included theosophy. Theosophy is not a religion, but a transcendental philosophy, which picks and mixes Sufism, Buddhism, Taoism, numerology, extrasensory perception, and the benign conspiracy theory that the entire world is controlled by a group of adepts. It is ecumenical, pacific, and opposed to the totalitarian exclusivity of monotheistic religions such as Islam.
Esperanto.
La universala lingvo antaŭgenis la komprenon kiu malhelpis du mondo militoj. La ok Esperanto-konferenco estis tense la akeĝeĝoj en 1913.
Folk dancing.
Nut gatherers' flags, panage grusting, balldocking, nonnies, and durdle weaving were all practiced in the gardens of the cloisters.
Folk singing.
Folklorists, chief among them Cecil Sharp and Arthur Wales, collected songs in pubs. Cunning country folk, hoping to be rewarded with a pint, were not above inventing age-old songs of comfrey bailing and blossom fraught.
Oh, let me front your blossom, me pretty young maid, in the greenwood wild and free. And there we will sup of the John Burley corn, although my sister you do be.
Folk medicine.
A catnip enema cleanses the urinary tract. An infusion of sumac leaves relieves allergic asthma. Make sure you identify the plants correctly before you try these at home.
Allotments.
Halley Stewart, who built the nearby village of Stewartby for his brickfield workers, entered Parliament as a member of the Allotment Party. He sponsored a series of acts obliging local authorities to provide allotments in towns. The catchphrase of his contemporary, the Liberal MP Jesse Collings, was, "3 acres and a cow for every man."
Beekeeping.
Edward Carpenter regarded bees as ideal utopians. Arthur McMurdo abandoned architecture in order to devote himself to writing tracts proposing that human society should be based on that of the hive. They were not published. This all added up to escapism on a grand scale.
It was escapism that could subsequently justify itself by pointing to the incorporation of certain of these enthusiasms in the mainstream of British life. But none of these crazes had the effect that the cottagey town itself had. It is the very place that became a template for Britain.
Such a layout on such a scale was unprecedented. There was at that time nothing else in the world like it. And there was no roundabout in Britain like this one. That's a proud boast. Letchworth's shortcomings were overlooked in the gust of enthusiasm that greeted it. And also overlooked was the fact that by 1903, London, from which Letchworth was supposedly a refuge, had drainage, electric lighting, and sanitation. The ramifications of Letchworth have been greater and more permanent than those of any other British social experiment of the 20th century. It has proved easy to dismantle socialism, welfarism, educational systems and public health care. But no government has had the will to curtail the horizontal pseudo-bucolic sprawl of the Englishman's castle.
When shadows fall and trees whisper day is ending, sweet dreams will ever take me home.
Was the garden city the necessity that its champions claimed, or an ultimately frivolous experiment? Before a single brick had been laid, the secretary of the Fabian Society, Edward Peace, wrote that we must make the best of our existing cities, and proposals for new ones are about as useful as would be arrangements for protection against visits from Mr. Wells's Martians.
Letchworth copied itself and diluted itself in doing so. It committed on-site auto-plagiarism. By the late 1920s, living in Letchworth or any one of its many clones signalled respectability. These were the places that the petty bourgeoisie aspired to. In other countries, such as Holland and Belgium, it was the principle that was copied. Great architects undertook schemes which shun Parker and Unwin's retrospection. But in Britain, it would be copied for its appearance's sake. It spawned with abandon. Many more arts and crafts houses were built after Letchworth than before it. The trickle-down grew to be a cascade. Every horizontal, land-hungry, jerry-built development from 1905 till the late 30s called itself a garden village.
Letchworth is where modern England began. In modern England, the industrial cities were systematically neglected throughout the 20th century. In no other European country is the history of urbanism the history of a resistance to urbanism, of a longing for a cosy and secure suburbanism. This is Letchworth's legacy.
What are you looking at?
Witness one of the world's most dramatic natural spectacles, the Severn Boar in Coast, next on BBC Two, followed by a trip to rural Devon for Spring Watch at 8.